Welcome to episode 3 of Investing with Impact. We will be talking about regenerative agriculture, and I'm delighted to be joined today by Chris Heathcote and Tom Dillon, co-heads of Regenerate Outcomes. Chris, Tom, hello.
Adrien.
Hello, good to see you again.
Delighted to be here.
So as planned, we would like to know more about regenerative farming, regenerative agriculture. It is a topic that is having great traction in the investing world, tackling issues of land use and carbon sequestration. And we're delighted to have you today to give us more information about the reason it's now a real topic in the finance world, the reason why farmers are buying into these techniques, and also more about the specificities of this type of farming and all the benefits as well as the challenges that it covers. So maybe just to start, if I could ask you, what is the context that brings regenerative farming, regenerative agriculture into the modern economy, and why do you see this particular practices becoming more and more interesting for?
I think there are a number of reasons why regenerative agriculture is having its day. I mean, to quote Jeremy Clarkson, which of course is the way you always start talking about agriculture, there are only 30 harvests left. And although as a statistic, that's undoubtedly wrong and is undoubtedly misleading, it's quite a useful tagline as to what's going on in the soil at the moment. And that is that the way we're farming is using the soil as a substrate and then putting chemicals on it to create the crops we want. Intensive agriculture practice since the Second World War. And what that is doing is it's taking away the ability of the plants to put carbon back into the soil. So the carbon is being taken out of the soil, harvest after harvest, until there is virtually no carbon left. One statistic, at the end of the Second World War, you'd find between 8 and 12% soil organic matter in the soil in the UK, and now it's looking more like 2 to 3%. And that's been the impact of farming intensively.
Interesting.
I would also add that the economics of farming have pushed regenerative agriculture to the forefront in terms of declining margins. You've got input costs, which particularly, if you look at the trends over recent decades, that has pushed more and more farms into this space where they're looking for alternatives whereby they can reduce their input costs and essentially rescue their production margins. So I'd say that was a factor.
Interesting. So you're saying it's a mix of environmental need to keep growing any type of crops, that we need to keep the soil organic matter to a good levels, and then also price pressure of input costs such as fertilizers and so on that may have been driven by macroeconomic environments.
There's some very, very important reasons why carbon in the soil is important. It's not just we're taking the carbon out to create crops. That's kind of fine, isn't it? Well, it isn't, because what the carbon in soil does is it creates the structure in soil. It allows the microbes to live within the soil. It allows the worms to inhabit the soil. It allows the soil to be a living entity rather than just a dead matter. But also it's the carbon in the soil that holds the water. So at a time when we're moving to more irregular weather patterns, and farmers, last year we had a massive period of drought. If you don't have much carbon in your soil, you are holding very little water in your soil. And when it does rain heavily, the soil is not bound together and gets washed away. So we see massive soil erosion and we see very poor water retention in the soil. In terms of sustainable farming, it's a disaster.
Interesting. Okay. So does this mean that to get to a healthy soil, you need more carbon in the soil, or you need more capacity to stock carbon in the soil? And if that is the case, I understand this will be the objective of regenerative agriculture. Mm-hmm. And how would you do that? What are the practices or the different means that you would use to get to that?
So
Okay.
before we get to the practices, there's why does regenerative farming restock the carbon? And so a plant living out in the wild in its natural environment soaks up the energy from the sun, takes in carbon dioxide, and takes that carbon dioxide and transfers it and creates sweet carbon which exudes from the root tips. And they do that because that carbon feeds the microbes, and it's the microbes that fix the nitrogen from the air as a plant available nutrient. So the way the cycle works is you capture the carbon dioxide, you strip the carbon, oxygen goes out, and that carbon then feeds the microbes, and it's the microbes that give the nitrogen to the plant. For that to work, you've got to have soil structure. The air's got to get in to get to those microbes. You've got to have those microbes. And for those microbes to exist, they feed on these sugary carbon.
Exudates.
Thank you, exudate is exactly the word I was looking for. The carbon exudates coming out of the root tips. So that's the basic behind it.
You can either look at it in terms of practices or a set of principles which dictate the decisions you make on the farm. We're following the lead of Understanding Ag, who are led by Gabe Brown and Dr. Alan Williams and others. And they essentially say that regenerative agriculture is a set of principles. To briefly recap these principles, you have 4 basic ecosystem processes. You have mineral cycling, water cycling, energy flow, and community dynamics. Community dynamics being essentially the way species interact, what we can call biodiversity to an extent. So those 4 ecosystem processes can be managed by various management principles, which can be summarized by the following. So you've got essentially keep armor on the ground, so the soil must be protected. It's the same principles as a vegetable garden, if you like, with mulch. So you can use biomass as mulch, or essentially protect the soil from wind and water erosion. You try and keep living roots in the ground for as long a part of the year as possible. Exactly what Chris was talking about in terms of the roots essentially channeling. By photosynthesis, they channel these carbohydrates into the soil horizons, and that forms the food for the microbes to be essentially sourcing nutrients back up to the plant. So that process creates the soil structure, which the microbiology thrive off essentially. So keeping roots in the ground for as long as possible is very important, because without roots you don't have that channel, that kind of highway of microbiology and activity, etc. And then you'd have other principles would include trying to integrate livestock to essentially in a regenerative farming system you have to provide continuing supplies of biomass to feed the microbiology. You can harness livestock in certain ways to provide that fertility. And again, for microbes, when forage is passed through the animal, it's not far richer from microbiology under the soil. So that's another principle. You also have limit disturbance. So that can cover that can refer to overgrazing, or it can refer to too many passes with a plough or whatever sides you want to apply. So the principle of rest and recovery is very important. We can't fully understand how nature works. So regenerative farmers understand that you essentially have to let certain things just breathe and happen, which is a really difficult thing for farmers who love to be busy. But it's a very important principle. Each farm has its own context. So no particular practice, going back to your question, even if it works on another farm, might not apply on your own farm. There are 3 more management principles which are very interesting in the Understanding Ag paradigm, which are essentially the principle of compounding effects. So every decision you make will either have a positive or negative compounding effect in the longer term. So that's a very interesting subject for another day. But then you have the principle of disruption, whereby similarly to athletics, you don't tell an athlete to do the same exercise every day. They will start to decline in performance. You have to essentially mix up your farming operation, disrupt the routines, and that has a very positive effect on biodiversity and productivity, etc. And then, lastly is the principle of diversity of enterprise. So biodiversity is absolutely is a management tool. It is a production tool in regenerative farming to let the food web, if you like, manifest on the farm. So instead of seeing a pest as something to exterminate, you understand what that pest is doing. Perhaps there's another trophic level that can be brought in to control that pest, and I won't have to pay for any of that. So there's some of the principles. So it's not necessarily practices, it's basically a system of principles which you can apply to your own farm.
Interesting.
If that makes sense.
Interesting.
There's an interesting, so if we take one of those animals in the land, before the Second World War, most farms were mixed livestock. You had both animals and arable, and dairy was grass-fed. And after the Second World War, we moved to a very different model. We ended up with the animals living on concrete in huge numbers. 40% of between 40 and 60% of our grain is grown to feed animals. So now what we have is we have the animals sitting in one place in a large group. We have the arable farms growing grain, which they harvest using vehicles. They then put onto trucks. They then truck to the animals eat it. The animal byproducts all end up in pits and in areas where they give off all sorts of problems. And so that's what we've ended up with. We've ended up with this intensive model where you have arable farmers and you have animal farmers, and they just sell each other product. What we are getting farmers to look back to is how the animal helps work the land. So the animal is part of disturbing the crust of the land, breaking it up, creating the fertilizer that's needed, clearing the cover crops, which otherwise are killed with Roundup and the like. And so if you can get a group of farmers to start working together, it's very hard to get an arable farmer who's just done arable for the last 70 years to suddenly reintroduce animals onto their land. It's very tough. But what you can do is get a livestock farmer who's in the same group as an arable farmer to take his animals to clear the cover crop, to break up the soil, to get rid of problem species. And in doing that, the livestock farmer rests his land for longer and therefore buys in less food for the animal, and the arable farmer doesn't have to drive vehicles over his land, doesn't have to buy Roundup to kill crops, and gets a far better quality soil at the end of it. The same sort of holistic ideas which can help farmers continue to farm the way they want in their context, but do it in a way which is working with the soil.
That's very interesting. So to summarize a bit of the key principles and definition of regenerative agriculture, what I understand is the farmers need a deep level of understanding of the land and what they're doing to essentially do less. Would that be a fair statement?
I don't know, Tom, what do you think? I think they continue to work hard, but they do it differently. And so whereas in the past, this is what one farmer said to me, so it's not my line. In the past, he'd have spent a lot of time sitting in the cab of his tractor. No, he now spends the same sort of time moving his animals between quite small contained paddocks. But and some of the other farmers who were in that group were sitting there saying, "Oh, well, I don't want to give up my time in my tractor." And he said, "Well, actually, you very quickly get used to the different way of doing things, and in fact, they do end up with more free time, I think, following this approach."
Yeah, it's an interesting subject. Time. I think there's a kind of reallocation of time, as Chris was saying. But going back to your original point, observational skills are absolutely central to regenerative farming system. That combined with extra kind of mentoring support to explain some of the phenomena which are very complex when you scratch the surface. A nice example, as Chris alluded to, is instead of a set stocked farm where you would have to monitor the stock by essentially going around all the fields, let's say just in this example, and then maybe bringing in the stock intermittently into the corrals to essentially, to get in the pens and review their any sicknesses and such like. When you're applying these principles and one of the principles is rest and recovery. So you'd be moving the animals more frequently, if you like, from parcel to parcel. That actually requires the animals to be sort of congregated, if you like, into larger groups. And moving the animals is an opportunity to observe those same illnesses which you would previously have checked out in the pens back at the farmhouse, if you like. So in that regard, that you're saving time because there's a single movement as opposed to patrolling the whole farm. But also you're observing better because the animals are walking past you from cell to cell, if you like, within the field. And it's in that regard, once you reach certain levels of this journey, we're told that you get more time because of these interesting little shifts of practices. So time's a really interesting subject, and often we hear that farmers are so busy that almost a different decision-making model is difficult for them to accommodate because they can't disrupt their routines. So that's actually one of the biggest challenges of a farm switching from conventional to regenerative is how do they adapt their routines and their time planning in the week.
Interesting. And I mean, a follow-on question on this topic on I think all the attributes that regenerative farming has and its potential appeal to a farmer. What would you say are the main benefits for a farmer to switch to regenerative agriculture? And also from your own experience with regenerative outcomes, how is the traction that you see in rural communities into entering these practices, this way of farming?
So one of the big benefits is the economic side. And so one statistic, over 40% of the farms operating today in the UK are only sustainable, financially sustainable, because of the European BPS, basic payment system, which is being wound down at the moment. So farmers are coming up against reducing grants and therefore more marginal profitability. And the thing about regenerative farming is it reduces the diesel costs, it reduces the costs of synthetic fertilizer, which are massively expensive at the moment, and it also reduces the vets bills because you're bringing less onto the farm. It's more a circularity within the farm, and that is better for the animals. So the economics, this is one way that farms can see a way to remaining financially sustainable in what's going to be quite hard times for them.
Interesting things. And what about the traction that you see with regenerative outcomes? It seems to be a very benefiting way of farming. Is it easy to convince farmers, or you don't need to convince farmers maybe?
From my experience so far, yes, there are farms which are really interested to enter into a long-term learning path, essentially. With the subsidies having been the way they have been for previous decades, that learning trajectory, if you like, let's say, stalled at certain points. So there is a real appetite now for farmers to essentially revisit some of the older ways. I mean, none of what we're talking about are new methods, by the way. In most cases, it's revisiting some older strategies which worked well but were displaced when a complex mix of subsidy, technology, market forces moved against the older ways, essentially. So there is, our impression is there is an appetite to enter into this long-term learning program. And what we try to do is we monitor and verify the soil carbon outcomes, which we expect to materialise if farmers follow the understanding ag principles, which we spoke about earlier. So there's an additional income which we expect to generate from the projects. There's the continuous learning. There's a range of other benefits which we spoke about in terms of improving production margins, seeing animal health improve, plant health improve,
biodiversity.
but also biodiversity. But yeah, exactly, and biodiversity ties into kind of well-being. There's a very strong argument to say that farmers, there are some worrying statistics about depression amongst the farming community, etc. So there's a very strong argument to say that the well-being that is generated from seeing all these positive impacts is a very strong driver as well.
And we see the farmers supporting each other. So some farmers are more advanced in regenerative farming. And so it's not just our friends from America coming over and telling us Brits how to do it. There's a really strong self-supporting element. And that helps community within the farms, helps create and maintain that community. And also it gives these farmers the feeling that they're going to have an asset to hand over to. You talked about traction. One example of that is we had Gabe Brown do a webinar, which we initially thought would be for a new group of farms we're setting up. So we set it up with that in mind. And then we thought, actually, it's an interesting topic. There should be a lot of farmers who want to know about this. So with a week to go to the webinar, we opened it up to any farm, and we had over 160 farms in a week sign on to come and listen. So there's a real interest. Don't get me wrong, all of those don't turn into client farms. But what there is a real interest to understand better what can be done more sustainably. So when you talk to them about how this is a less polluting way to farm and how it's a way to track your pollution so you actually know what's going on, then there's a real interest in that as well. Farmers want to do the right thing, but they also want to be farmers. And this is one way they can do both.
Great, thanks a lot. It's very interesting. I mean, we did speak about the benefits of regenerative agriculture. I mean, as you mentioned it right now, I'd love to take the big leap myself and become a regenerative farmer. But there must be challenges, otherwise it would be too easy.
No challenges at all. It's very straight. Yes, there are plenty of challenges.
What do you think? What do you see as the main challenges? You did mention early on maybe a slight drop in yield. That's something that we hear a lot. Any other challenges that you think decreasing a bit the traction that you'd like to get?
Do you want me to go first and you go second? So
Sure.
My first one would be innate conservatism amongst farms. And so, you get, I'm going to make these statistics up, but it feels about right. Probably between 20 to 25% of farms who are reasonably open-minded and thinking about the way they farm and quite interested in changing. Then there's sort of about the same again, maybe, who are willing to listen but are a bit more cautious. And then there's a rump of farms who, this is the way my granddad farmed, this is the way my father farmed, why do I have to change the way I farm? And so part of the challenge as a business is selecting the farms who are most likely to succeed, and that's sort of where we are. But as a longer term view of this market, as someone who's passionate about the impact regenerative agriculture can have on this country and on the environment, then we need to start getting those 50% to be more open-minded. And that's a challenge. Maybe it's generational change, I don't know, but it's a challenge.
Yeah, and just to add to that, switching to regenerative agriculture often involves a questioning of your day-to-day activities, which may have been the kind of status quo or the standard, if you like, before. So it's actually quite a tiring and psychologically difficult process, that, from what we've heard from some of our farm clients. What we're trying to provide with our projects is a kind of mentoring network, so that if mistakes are made, there's not like a knee-jerk reaction to go back to conventional or to redress it in the wrong ways. There's a careful assessment and questioning of why it didn't work in that particular context, and the mentors with experience that they have and the network that they have across the world with thousands of different regenerative farms can essentially help the farm to navigate those setbacks.
You talked about yield drop. We're not getting a lot of fundamental concern about that because the cost of fertilizer is so high that actually talking about reducing that upfront input cost blows away any yield drop. So one of our farms used to take 2.5 to 3 tons of barley to cover his costs per hectare. He's now down to 1 ton of barley to cover his cost per hectare. So that's a 66% more yield drop on that basis. And so, the yield drop is there, at least in the early years, but it is not the defining factor about what we're doing. And it's not the defining factor for the farmers either.
Interesting. So you're saying maybe there's a yield drop, but the gain that you have in not spending money for fertilizers and other big machinery makes actually your business more profitable.
Getting your farms to think profitability rather than yield. Yeah. In fact, that's another. For some farms, that's quite a big change of mentality as well. But that's where these farmers are going to. They're saying, actually, I'm yielding 12.5 tons of wheat per hectare, but I'm still losing money. And so at that point, they start to say, well, actually, I'm working like nothing else, turning out this massive yield, and yet there's no money in my pocket at the end of the period. And so they are the ones who are starting to say, well, actually, I should be thinking about the profit that's being made by the farm, and then it's all about driving that.
And also, it's worth pointing out that, especially with the Understanding Ag approach, it usually isn't a question of a wholesale shift of the whole farm. What's encouraged generally is to trial certain approaches in different parts of the farm. So in terms of yield drop, I think it's a bit simplistic to assume that there's a general yield drop. It applies in certain cases, but actually what we've heard is that the productivity can actually accelerate quite significantly once the biomass and those cycles start to function properly. And the approach of trialing and observing and then applying can actually slot in so that that yield drop may not have to occur, certainly to the extent that's sometimes spoken about.
Thank you, Tom and Chris. I mean, that's very interesting, and I think we all have a much clearer picture about what is regenerative agriculture and it being a potential solution to issues in the farming sector. You did speak early on in the discussion about soil organic matter and its relationship with carbon. I understand that opening the farming industry to the carbon industry is a change maker for many reasons. Could you please tell us a bit more about what is soil organic matter, what is its relationship with carbon, and also how is carbon changing anything into either the economics of agriculture, or maybe in the penetration of regenerative agriculture within the different practices that we see.
Soil organic matter, if you like, is the house and the food for the microbiology. Microbiology plays, as we spoke about earlier, plays that role in cycling carbon. There are many different forms of carbon, which I think is another interesting feature of this learning process about regenerative agriculture in terms of, we speak quite simplistically about carbon in the carbon markets, but actually there's a whole world of understanding the different types of carbon. If you're increasing your biomass turnover by these regenerative principles, that will convert into soil organic matter, which in turn increases the sequestration of stable forms of carbon. So you have labile carbon, which is essentially the carbon which is sequestered and breathed on an hourly, daily basis, every second, obviously. And so that, carbon sequestration is complex in that regard, but over time, if you apply these principles, the proportion of stable organic carbon, which is stored in the soil aggregates and in the glues, etc., which are in the soil, increases, and that will continue to descend down the soil horizons. So it's very important to, with projects such as ours, to measure at the right depths, because the impact, for example, of that principle of keeping living roots in the ground for as long as possible, those roots will be essentially creating soil, moving that soil horizon further down, or let's say moving that soil organic matter and the carbon deeper into the soil profile.
Talking about the importance of it, so the carbon is, if you like, the primary thing that we're affecting. but it has a number of knock-ons, a number of knock-on benefits. And so to create this, the first thing we have to impact is the biodiversity within the soil and within the field. And so we find that biodiversity comes in pasture lands in increased varieties of plants. We find that the way we use the animals opens up the seed bank, and we get that diversity returning to the fields. We get an increase in insect life, and on the back of that, an increase in bird life. So BNG is an important part of what we're doing. The same thing is that the carbon allows you to open up the soil. The soil structure is more open. So when it rains, more of that water falls and is retained in the ground rather than runs off the ground. That benefits by building up the stocks of water in the fields and preventing soil runoff and sedimentation in the watercourses. And the third thing is we're reducing the amount of synthetic fertilizer, particularly nitrates and phosphates. And this country has a massive problem with phosphate overrun in the fields, from the fields into the watercourses. And in many parts of this country, you're not allowed to build a house until you can prove nutrient neutrality of that home. In other words, you're not going to put any more phosphates into the watercourses. We can address all of those problems. What does it mean economically? Well, the vision is that as the farmer does things which are environmentally positive, then you find a purchaser for those environmental benefits. And if this works perfectly, then we'll be able to stack the benefits. So by one change, you can sequester carbon. That can be sold through the mechanism of carbon credits. You can reduce sedimentation. That has a benefit to the water companies because it increases the life of their pumps and reduces maintenance. You can reduce nitrogen and phosphates, and that again is of benefit to both water companies and the developers, who both need to avoid that to either use their land banks or they have to remove it as part of their core business in the case of the water utility. And then finally, there's biodiversity net gain, which is going to be a new area where developers are going to have to prove they're increasing biodiversity net gain before they destroy any habitat. So all of these benefits can be stacked on top of each other for the benefit of the farmer, and that's the basic idea.
Amazing. So in summary, the soil organic matter is the mean to capture on the long term carbon in the soil, and you will be rewarded for the amount of sequestration that you increase within the soil that you're working on. Is soil carbon a very developed sector? Who would be buying carbon credits from soil activity, and what do you think? How do you see this sector developing?
It's a new space, certainly, and the government's working hard to provide a framework by which the different standards are regulated. So that is an ongoing process now with DEFRA and the British Standards Institute, etc. And we want to play a part in that to understand and to contribute. The buyers, in our case, would be interested in high social and environmental impact projects, which have a very long-term horizon. And again, that comes back to the focus on education and principles, that it's very, very rare for a farm, once they start to adopt these principles, to actually revert. And that's always the challenge with carbon markets, is that loss of permanence. So what we've tried to do is create a structure that ensures that longevity and provides the buyers with some assurance that the credits are going to have impact far beyond the soil carbon that's in the ground, but also last the stretch of time.
For me, there's two different ways you can do good in the carbon dioxide, global warming debate. One is you can reduce the amount we're doing bad, and that's vitally important, obviously. But equally important is we've got to start winding the clock back. And earlier on I said from 8 to 12% to 2 to 3%. That carbon has been lost to the atmosphere. That's where it's gone in the end. By one way or another, that's where it ends up. We need to start turning that clock back and sequestering the carbon. So if you look at the carbon markets, the voluntary carbon markets we're talking about now, then out of those markets, the vast majority are non-verified carbon. And then there's a relatively small portion, about 30%, which is verified carbon. And of that 30%, which is verified carbon, only about 5% is sequestered carbon. So this soil sequestered carbon, if the market can work, if what we're doing works, this is going to be very high value carbon, which is actually turning the clock back and turning the soil back into the carbon bank it always was in the past. And so I think it's important in terms of climate, and it's important in terms of healthy soil, which leads to biodiversity. So it's a pretty critical part of this whole process.
Interesting. How are the farmers benefiting from the carbon credit creation? How do you see your scheme or other scheme in the industry taking into account, the farmers and the farmers' reaction to that?
I mean, it's a difficult market at the moment because it's described by many farmers as it feels like it's the Wild West, because there are a lot of different people offering a lot of different things, and it's quite hard to work out which I mean, even the way we call them schemes, which already sounds a bit dubious, doesn't it? And so it's working out which of these schemes are trustworthy and are going to stand the test of time. And I think this initial, it's like many markets, when a market is new, there's a massive proliferation of entities trying to cash in on the market. And then over time, you get some regulation coming in, you get a better understanding of the market, and those schemes which aren't well founded will fall away. And the reason that we're involved in this is because we want to create the highest quality possible scheme. And to do that, you've got to be verified, you've got to run really good processes, and you've got to have something which has more benefit to the farmer than a bit of cash in their pockets. So for us, there is the large majority of any carbon sales that would happen will go to the farm. So they will get a useful amount of money, but they're not carbon farmers. This is never going to be enough for them to change everything they do because they're suddenly going to be carbon farmers. The carbon is an additional bit of revenue which helps them to survive and be sustainable. But it's all the rest of it. It's the social impact, it's the legacy, it's the sustainability, it's about being a force for good. All those things are really important to these farms as well.
And also maybe we can add the resilience of the farm.
Massively important, absolutely massively important. At a time when I live in the country, I walk the fields with my dogs all the time, and you can see how quickly the intensively farmed fields go from mud on the surface because the water hasn't soaked in to baked, dry and cracking. And that sort of speed of drying out is just appalling, and resilience will be a bigger and bigger issue, I suspect.
Thank you both. Very, very interesting discussion. I'm glad that we know more a bit about the Wild West of carbon. I think we all hear about compliance market, voluntary market, and it's very interesting to see a view from people working actually in soil carbon. I mean, just taking a step back from what we already discussed. So there's a financial incentive with carbon. There is also potentially a financial incentive with higher profitability. So what would you say? Why would you say the sector needs capital if it could potentially fund for itself?
Yeah, I think it's an interesting point. There are a couple of bits built into that. Partly there's a timing issue. You change the way you farm, that then helps you secrete carbon, and that takes time, and then that ends up building through to an increase in payments. So part of it is a timing issue, but more importantly, we're not trying to set a bunch of processes in play. I mean, some carbon schemes will say, we'll give you £100 if you do X, and £50 if you do Y, and £70 if you do Z. And those schemes, they're kind of fine. But what we're trying to do is we're trying to change the way the farmer thinks, so the farmer is farming his farm, both regeneratively and effectively. And we think this is the best way to create long-term regenerative farmers, rather than short-term carbon farmers. And so a big part of why we raise money is to allow for that initial burst of education where very experienced regenerative agricultural farmers and consultants work with farmers on their farm to understand what their farm is like and understand how best to farm that farm, both for the farmer and in the context of the farm. So we talk about context a lot, and we're not here trying to tell a farmer how to farm. We're here inviting the farmer to work out what regenerative farming looks like in his context, for him, for his family, for his farm. And we believe that's how we will hang on to these farmers for the next 100 years, rather than them doing something for 3 or 4 years and then walking away. What do you think, Tom?
Yeah, absolutely. I'll just add that there's a lot of interest from big institutional investors and such like in natural capital and regenerative farming specifically. However, the gap between institutional finance and farms is a space which we try to occupy. And farmers know and love their land. They're very good contractors to deliver the outcomes which these investors are seeking. So that's essentially, we provide, if you like, an engine by which we can raise capital, channel it to the right farms who are well aligned to the investors and to other project stakeholders. And then those farms essentially carry those regenerative principles, deliver the outcomes. So it's a kind of chain which we try to create in that regard.
I think the last point actually is, and it's an interesting question, why do we need money? Our primary aim is not to find big estates, help them become regenerative and make them even more profitable than they were. Our aim is to help farmers on a whole variety of scales, including some relatively small farms, continue to survive and to allow that community to continue to work. And actually, these guys can't afford the upfront learning, they can't afford to baseline their soil, they can't afford all these things. What they can afford to do is change the way they farm and then give up a proportion of the benefits that they create to allow them to get onto this sort of conveyor belt of better soil. And so that to me is the thing. This money allows us to go to farms who couldn't afford to do this otherwise and help them to join and become part of it.
And there's another feature here, and that is to run a high standard of verification for a project. Again, is something which the farm certainly doesn't want to do, based on our experience, but also can't afford to do on its own. So we aggregate farms into clusters so we can manage those costs centrally and manage the practicalities of those standards, which are quite tough and rigorous, if you like, for a reason, because that's why we're aiming for the Vera standard, which is arguably the highest standard on the market. So these are things which the farm doesn't want to do, doesn't have time to do, doesn't really have the cash flow for in the short term. That's why we need the upfront finance. So it's not just the mentoring, it's certainly the management of the standard, if you like.
It's very interesting. Thanks a lot. I think it's fascinating to see that even in an environment such as agriculture, where everything is big, large, and has to be extensive, maybe the solution is actually just financing knowledge and data and being able to better understand its own fields to really maximize it and make it the most resilient.
Absolutely.
Thanks a lot, Tom and Chris. This was a fascinating discussion. We can say now that we're maybe not regenerative farmers, but we do know more about the solutions for sustainable land use and carbon sequestration. Thanks a lot.
Thank you for inviting us in.
Adrien. Thank you.
Thank you.